All right.
All right. So, um, I, I'll just uh guide you through the original argument because I was like talking in the debate channel on Freedom's Legion, and then they were just randomly like, "Oh yeah, you should debate atheist." All right. So where is um right? So I was arguing with.
Oh,
Okay,
and
so
this one,
there's
well,
this
if that's the
one.
case, if you, it'd be great if you could either screenshot or screen cap or something and just,
Yeah, let me screen share.
that'll work.
But yeah, I'll just briefly guide you through.
Okay.
Yeah, so Shinto just randomly added me. How am I an anarchist and a Christian? And then
Uh, Anarchist
like,
and a Christian? Oh, that's real easy.
and then yeah, so then just like a bunch of people, it was just like a simultaneous argument against like three guys, and then I think we moved it
I
to.
disagree with the fact that anarchism is quote unquote natural law. That's a misinterpretation of Locke.
Well, no, because Locke, um, because if you consistently apply Locke, and his property rights, then you just arrive at anarchism.
Not really, because with anarchism being essentially stateless and governless for the most part,
Yeah.
with there being no governing body, then property rights are effectively meaningless. You have nothing to couch them in.
Well, Locke himself was the first one to acknowledge that you don't need a state to have property rights, right? That the property rights don't come about as like being granted a deed, they come about through homesteading, and that they come about through just, oh, this is someone's property because he mixed his labor with it, not because he was granted
Right,
it by the king.
but Locke never actually addressed the issue of the whole might makes right argument because that's effectively what it becomes at that point. Great, cool, you homesteaded a property. Somebody walks up, shoots you and your entire family, and takes it.
Well, that's the extension that people like Roth or Proudhon first, and then later like Spooner and Rothbard made,
Uh,
was that these property rights exist, and then you create property, and because you've created this property, only you have the right to it, and then which is the and then so it's one, the rejection of a principle of might makes right, but then it's also um, then also Proudhon and Spooner and Rothbard then began to theorize, especially Rothbard using Austrian economics, theorizing about uh, how a universally applied natural law theory would work, and like how it would look. Hello.
no, I'm still here. Sorry, I'm reading a few
Okay.
things. Refreshing myself on the Austrian school when it comes to economics because not one I've looked into very often because most people don't take anarchism seriously.
Well, the Austrian school isn't exclusively anarchist. It's just since like the
No, but it is
1560s.
incredibly flawed.
No, because the Austrian school. Well, not originally, but once after Mises was essentially just entire economic or collection of economic theories, all derived from the single axiom that man acts.
Right. I'm great. Of course, my mom tries to call me right now. That's not gonna work. We're just gonna minimize that for now. I can always call her back.
But yeah, let me get you to the point where because I think there was a little bit of just repetition. Um,
There's a lot of repetition. What tends to go in that group.
yeah. So where did they first mention you? Right. I said yeah. So Blake was like he thinks that government should be consensual. Therefore, I was like, oh yeah. So if you think everything should be consensual, then you're an anarchist. And then I linked to Anatomy of
Except
the State.
that's just essentially rendering anarchism meaningless, though, because you at that point you're trying to turn anarchism into everything. Because having a contract like such as a constitution, that sort of thing, that is a form of consent to the governed. Now, granted,
Well, no, it
there
isn't.
are people who were definitely excluded from that contract, and so obviously it needs to be readdressed. But
Well, no, because the social contract fundamentally isn't consensual, right? Like not every individual that like when the Constitutional
no,
Convention
no,
occurred.
you're conflating consent to the governed with social contract. Those are two different concepts.
Okay, well, when the Constitutional Convention occurred, it's not like every single person in America just said, "Oh, yep, I'm gonna sign on to this contract. I 100% agree that me and then also every
Well, no,
single one of my
just born into it.
descendants will if you're well if you so in that case if you're born into um having a contractual allegiance to a state, that is to acknowledge that the state itself already has a property right over all of like what it claims, right? Like you can inherit a contractual obligation in the case of like an apartment, but you or even like not something that's rented, but something that's like leased, um, or that I forget the term, but yeah, whatever. Um, but that is to say that the federal government at the time of the Constitutional Convention had absolute sovereignty over and like ownership over all of the land, you know, east of the
Well,
Appalachians
no.
and west of the Atlantic.
Well, no, they didn't. They very obviously didn't. That's why they consistently made and broke treaties with the Native Americans. Over 400 different treaties, and I believe all but one or two of them broken within a couple of, usually within a couple of years, some as long as a decade after acceptance.
Well, yeah, so clearly the federal government didn't have like ownership over all of this. This wasn't
No,
their
and
land.
neither did anybody else except for the Native Americans,
Yeah, it was unowned, except for the land that was owned by natives.
which was pretty much all of it. They had claim to it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, still, but this is so all of the yeah. So that then renders the idea of like this is an inherited contract invalid because there is no because the state didn't have ownership. Therefore, if you homestead land on the frontier that's uninhabited, then the and there's no rightful owner to it, then the state doesn't have authority over you because the
Well,
state didn't
except
own
what
it.
did have authority would have been, say, the native governments, what existed of those at the time, because the homesteaders themselves had no right to be there.
Hold on, could you repeat that? I zoned out.
Oh, so the homesteaders themselves had no right to be there.
Well, like this is like okay. Let's just say for so that we don't get into like a historical argument. Um,
I mean, like if you're talking about anarchism and you're talking about the United States and things like that, you're ultimately going to get into geopolitics and historical geopolitics. That's inevitable. The two are inextricably linked.
Well, yeah, but like the
Like
purpose
a
of
purely
like
philosophical discussion on the topic of anarchism is honestly pointless. Just like a purely philosophical discussion on, say, evolution is completely meaningless because it completely divorces itself from the reality that we find ourselves in and how these concepts are actually put into practice and utilized by either governments, peoples, or the consequences of historical action.
well, no, but the purpose is to question the principle because like there is no consent of the governed, like that is actual consent in the case of any government that exists today.
Well, no, I mean, I would argue that there, to an extent, is because essentially, if you don't like where you're at, okay, you have the right to leave. You have the right to immigrate somewhere else if somewhere else will take you, which in most instances, somewhere else will.
But that's again just asserting that like everything within the United States is rightfully owned by the US. Therefore, if you don't wish to participate with the US, you should just go to Canada, which isn't true because the US wasn't the original appropriator of all this land.
Well, no, no, the U.S. wasn't the original appropriator, but the U.S. is the current possessor.
So then you're just um, making the exact thing that you opposed earlier, and then you're just saying that might makes right because possession does.
No,
Then you're
I'm
just
not.
claiming that
I'm
possession
not saying.
makes right.
No, that's not correct. That's a misunderstanding of my position here. Um, what I'm simply stating is a statement of fact. That doesn't mean I agree with it. That doesn't mean I condone it. It's a statement of fact. The United States government is the current possessor of the continental United States plus the territory of Alaska and Hawaii.
Yeah, they but that
And
that
of course, Texas. They're the
and
current possessor.
yeah, but
And
they
in
are not
any
the owner.
contract, in any contract law ever, whoever is the current possessor of the contract or current possessor of the real property is de facto the owner.
Um, no, because ownership and possession are two different things, right? Like ownership is a legitimate like ownership is essentially the right to possession. Although ownership is the right to absolute decision making over something. Possession being just current control of something. Like you can have possession of something without being the owner of it. And if you possess
Okay,
something
so
without being
then
the owner of it, then
so
you're
then you would agree with the notion that the continental United States belongs to the Native American tribes then.
yeah. I would
It is it
well
is they own it, we possess it.
there's different um that's a very broad argument because like not all land was owned um prior to
No,
American arrival.
they considered it owned. There were
Well, just because they
areas
considered it
where
owned doesn't mean that it's actually owned, right? Like again,
well
the
no,
modern
see now
United
you're getting
States considers like public land to be owned, but it's not. And by public land, I mean like, the wilderness that is
yeah, like
being
national
used for
parks, things
anything.
like that. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it theoretically is if you believe the Conservation Act.
Elaborate.
Um, I forget what year, but the Conservation Act that was passed under President Theodore Roosevelt, it set aside it set aside all public lands not currently in use or owned as property held in trust by the U.S. federal government for the preservation of the natural beauty.
But again, this is assuming that the United States properly like has a claim to this, which it doesn't, because one,
Right,
it
and
wasn't the original.
which means that none of us have any claim to it. Only the Native Americans would, if you want to go
This
down
is
that
this is
road.
assuming that the Native Americans had absolutely like in they owned every square inch of of North America, which they didn't. They had
No, historically they roamed every square mile of continental U.S. land.
well, yeah, but roaming doesn't necessarily mean ownership. Like if
No, it's
I
their no,
like
it's their territory. It's what they stayed within. It's they had their own loosely defined borders with other tribes. They even fought over ownership and control.
well, there's different because there's different
At that point, you're making a societal judgment. You're not actually judging ownership at that point. You're not judging the concept. You're just judging the societal difference between a Native American tribe and Western civilization.
well, no, the Native Americans certainly had property and they had um they had different mechanisms of property. Like they didn't have just this is um they didn't just like settle land and then
Well,
just
no,
own the land and settle.
because the majority of them, all the way up until the early colonial period, were mostly hunter-gatherer tribes,
Yep.
and so in essence, their ownership was over the entirety of the territory that they roamed seasonally throughout the year for their purposes of hunting and gathering. Which, when you factor in all of the North American tribes, uh, that covers every square inch of the continental United States. About the only
Well,
argument you'd have would be Alaska, but there again, most of it was completely uninhabitable, so not really
there's
much to say
there's
on that.
there one there can't oh why am I saying one there? It's not even a second point. The
It's okay. I do that too
the
sometimes.
the so there's sort of like a necessary so when it comes to like I don't know, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but like um when it comes to like a native tribe laying claim to a portion of land that usually would be like maybe like the size of like Massachusetts, something like that. I think would be the average size of
I mean,
these native
considering
tribes.
that the entirety of the state of Massachusetts was a portion of the territory owned by the Massachusetts people, sure.
Yep. So
They didn't like claim to roughly state-sized portions. Cla- they claimed everything from uh small areas such as the smaller areas occupied by the Narragansett, which would fit inside the greater Atlanta metroplex in Georgia, all the way up to the Navajo, which their roaming territory covered uh, California, pretty much the entire state of Arizona, most of New Mexico, pretty much all the way up to the mouth of the Grand Canyon. So this is several states worth. So you really can't just arbitrarily pick an average size
oh
and
yeah,
just go from there and then assert that, okay, well, if there's a 100 Native American tribes and they all, on average, occupied a territory the size of Massachusetts, that leaves X percentage of the continental U.S. uninhabited. That just doesn't fly because
well
that doesn't
no
take into account differences.
the but the natives fundamentally they didn't emborder and like they didn't emborder and homestead land. They just walked over it, and like walking over and roaming stuff does not necessarily mean that they
And that's where you're getting into the judging a cultural difference between the Native American aspect of ownership and the Western version.
and also this is describing not even necessarily ownership but a governmental claim or even it's inferring a collective property right, which is I'm not very well versed in the argument as to why collective property rights are contradictions, but I think I could probably explain it if you need me to.
Uh, Essentially, people try to make the claim that collective property rights are quote unquote self contradictory because if all have equal claim or control over a piece of property, then nobody has claim over it, which is honestly kind of ridiculous. I mean, you have HOAs all over the US that function relatively well, despite the Council of Karens that a lot of them turn out to be. But that's just more group psychology and being drunk with a modicum of tenuous power than anything else. That's more psychological than governmental at that point.
Well, there the HOAs aren't necessarily collective property rights. They're more, just a
No,
contractual
they're more
agreement between people to.
oligarchical, but I was going for a
But
loose analogy at that.
but then all oh fuck um uh but like as to what ownership is like to have a property right in something is to have the right to make or the absolute right to make decisions as to how that thing is used.
Right.
Therefore,
So
you
the
if
Native Americans exercised their absolute right as a people to roam it and not make improvements upon it and to leave it as is
but
because they
if
also believe the land
if
itself
one of
is
them
sacred.
wished to make a change, then
The others
then
would probably have allowed it because that did happen. You look at the Algonquin people when they slowly made the
well
transition from a hunter-gatherer society to an agrarian society. It
but
started.
say like one of them wished to make a change to what they to this, collective land, and all of the rest of them did not want this, then the majority has the property right, the singular individual does not. So not all, it's not collectively owned by all of them, it's only collectively owned by people who agree as to how it should be used. And
Right, because
this
that's how
can't
societies at their core function. Like you can't have a group of animals without there being some sort of societal structure.
define societal structure.
I mean, some sort of internal moderation, self-governance, call it what you will. Tribalism at its core. Because by definition, biologically speaking, especially humans, we are social animals. Even with no input given, babies will tribalize.
And
They will sort themselves into collectives. They will form rudimentary societies.
but
We
this
see this
doesn't
in all aspects of the animal kingdom with the mental capacity or with the brain functionality necessary to cooperate.
but that doesn't at all, prove that a collective property right can exist, right? Like within
It
um
doesn't prove that any right can exist. Not even Locke actually demonstrates that the rights themselves exist. He merely asserts them. There's no actual evidence that any of the natural rights put forth by John Locke actually exist. Ultimately, when you get into the concept of rights, we either accept things as purely axiomatic, as if they're true on their face without actually investigating the claim, or we get to a point where it effectively comes down to a form of special pleading when you really get down to it. It's just like when you deal with certain arguments for the existence of God, right? Um, Presuppositionalism comes to mind. They say, well, yes, our argument is circular, but the atheist argument is also ultimately circular, but because ours includes God, it's virtuously circular, whereas the atheist argument is viciously circular, which is a clear cut example of a special pleading fallacy. Now, I'm not trying to bring God into the concept of governmental or economic debates, merely using that as an example of what a special pleading fallacy is, in case anyone who listens to this at a later time may not know what that is.
I again didn't pay attention that much, but I sort of I don't think we're going anywhere talking about rights, so I'm just gonna change subject to an economic argument rather than philosophical one, or yeah, more
Well, I
economic
mean,
in the case.
if it can't stand on its own philosophical merit, then going any further with it really presents a bit of a problem for the whole concept.
Well, I want to make the argument that I was primarily trying to make
Oh, okay.
with the Freedom's Legion boys was that um, the existence. So the state, right, is a. Would you agree, like a monopoly on violence?
Um, yeah, if we want to use the Ben Shapiro definition of it, sure, we can work with that for now.
Yeah,
It may require adjustment later, depending on where we go with this, but for now, we'll consider it tacitly accepted. Sure.
and actually, I'll make it even a bit more specific. Is um, a monopoly on violence that primarily obtains its revenue through taxation.
Mm, that is a very odd caveat to tack onto that. I'm
Well,
not sure I agree.
I'm pulling from Rothbard's definition of the state, which I'll I think I have my I'll even just use his definition. Oh, and I have to let my cat out. All right, so that's right. So reading from Anatomy of the State. The state, in the words of Oppenheimer, is the organization of the political means. It is the systematization of the predatory process over a given territory. For crime, at best, is sporadic and uncertain. The parasitism is ephemeral, and the coercive parasitic lifeline may be cut off at any time by the resistance of the victims. The state provides a legal, orderly, systematic channel for the predation of private property. It renders certain, secure, and relatively peaceful the lifeline of the parasitic caste in society. Since production must always precede predation, the free market is interior. This isn't even the Rothbard formats this essay really weirdly.
No, this is how Rothbard defines it. I'm actually looking at Anatomy of the State itself, and yeah, this is from the third paragraph in the section "What a State Is."
Yeah. Um, I swear he has a much more simple definition in whatever.
No,
Uh,
economists never go for completely simple definition. I mean,
but yeah.
just Milton
So
Friedman.
yeah, we don't talk about Friedman.
He was
Um,
probably the one who most simply defined things, but there again, he was one of those that peddled the nonsense that the Laffer curve actually is real when it's actually not mathematically sound.
but anyway, um, so just the state is a monopoly on um conflict resolution a monopoly on conflict, right? Rather than violence, because this is a differentiation that a lot of
Well,
modern Rothbardians make.
let's go with this instead. Instead of using the word violence, instead of using the word conflict, why not say the state has a monopoly on force?
Well, the
Because
the
that because force implies everything from force of violence to force of law to force of contract to force of governance. It's essentially an all-encompassing term of what government is.
all right,
It's
for this sake,
it's
we'll use
monopoly on
that one.
force.
All
Yeah.
right. So then, uh, what is your justification for the existence of a state? I should have started with that.
Justification for the existence of a state. in all honesty, I'm not even gonna say that there's truly a justification for a state's existence other than they tend to come about as a natural consequence of humanity's own tribalism. I mean, you look at the earliest quote unquote states, they formed around things such as ethnic and religious differences. Um, it's really just a natural consequence of human tribalism.
So
Whether like
so
whether or not there's like a philosophical justification for a state's existence, it's effectively inarguable that state will come about as a consequence of large numbers of people aggregating themselves.
so then
It's a consequence of biology.
okay, so you you don't have like a like so you you don't necessarily advocate for the existence of a state. You don't think it's like, some good thing that a state should exist. You just think that the state is inevitable.
Right. Yeah, the state is a concept of a state, yes, is inevitable. Some form of state is going to happen. Um, in some shape, way, fashion, or other. Like even when you take the principles of anarchy, right? If you have a group of anarchists and they're off in their own corner and they've defined a border for themselves and they adhere to even a non-aggression pact like what the Mises Caucus libertarians advocate for, um, and only go about their own way, they have formed a state.
No.
Just because a state doesn't necessarily mean it has a central governing body. A state simply is, while yes, the modern interpretation of a state is a monopoly on force, essentially, when you get right down to it, a state is really a collection of people who agree to abide by certain rules. Even the rule of don't mess with me, I don't mess with you, here's my property, that's your property, that's the formation of a state.
Well, the formation of a
A
like
governing body does not a state make.
hold on, repeat that.
I would go so far as to say a governing body, a specific system of governance itself, does not a state make. And so, in essence, what I would actually propose is that government is the monopoly on force.
So then,
Because a state can exist without a government. Will it exist for very long? Probably not. But it can exist, theoretically.
so then, so government would be monopoly on force. Then what is the state?
This this
Or
state
is it
is
like a collection of
this,
people agreeing to rules as prior
right. A
okay.
state is a collection of individuals who agree to abide by certain rules within a defined area.
Okay. So
Because a state naturally does tend to create borders. They tend to create lines of division, whether geographically or ideologically between each other. They tend to separate themselves. It's a form of self segregation.
so then does does man, I'm sorry, I keep just pausing for I'm not used to doing VC debates. Um
It's okay. I think faster than I type, so VC is
mhm.
pretty much the way I tend to work.
Yeah, I'm bad at remembering things when I hear it.
If you ever need me to repeat anything, if you ever need me
Yeah.
to repeat anything, let me know and I'll go over it. I'll probably end up summarizing or maybe, you know, finding a different way to explain it in some instances in case there was an issue with how I explained it the first time. Not in any attempt at dishonesty, but more just to make it easier to understand. Because sometimes, an initial explanation can be kind of rambly. That's just the nature of a voice chat, really.
Yeah. So
It's this organization of thoughts.
the I would say the problem with the how you would define a state is that the a bunch of people or um because then that's the actually wait no I don't even have a problem with the definition of a state. But I would say that that doesn't apply to what we would certainly describe as states. Like we don't um we don't all come together and agree to follow, the statutes passed by Congress. No, we follow them because we will be put in a cage if we don't.
Right, because that's a consequence of the existence of government, not necessarily the existence of a state.
Right. So then it's the
The
existence
state,
of a
the
government, but
state, the
not the
existence of the
existence of
state.
a state. If a state is people agreeing to follow rules.
Say that one more time.
So then the today we exist under a government but not under a state because it isn't people agreeing to follow rules. It's, people being forced to follow rules.
I would say it's actually a more nuanced and complex bit of both. And here's what I mean by that. I mean, we all uh, we all in the United States tend to agree that a concept of the United States exists, and we all tend to collectively share what that concept is. Now, what the vision for the future of that or what it should be can differ, but we all tend to have a fairly consistent, unified concept of what the United States is as its people. And so, in essence, we do live within a state. However, that state, as far as control exists, is subsumed by the federal government. We exist within a
So
state upon which a government has imposed itself.
so a state is so you could have a state without rulers.
Theoretically, yeah.
Okay.
As far as whether it would last for very long. Yeah, that was the point I was making the entire time. Is that like an anarchist state could theoretically exist in that there is no overarching governing body, at least in the physical sense, but there would still be rules that were agreed upon by the inhabitants that would in essence be kind of a de facto government, not as a decision making body, not as a true monopoly on force as we're defining government for the purposes of this discussion, but essentially the formation of a social contract, a very primitive, rudimentary form of government.
So what would you say is your contention with the concept of a, complete property rights, non-aggression principle society?
I would say that at least in essence, um, like with Austrian economics, when you want to talk about things like inflation and things like that, some of what it asserts doesn't seem to hold true in the face of reality and what actually happens. But there again, there's arguments against that in and of itself, in that we don't live in an Austrian theory of economics economy, so you can't really apply it, I guess. But a theory on economics should be generally applicable to all economies, as far as it should be able to make objective observational predictions. That's what a theory is.
Well,
Is an explanation of a phenomena and the ability for to make predictions with strong explanatory power. And Austrian theory really doesn't have that.
I wouldn't.
Uh,
I don't think I know a single Austrian that would make that argument. The the little
well,
caveat that
no,
needs to
because
come
the
in.
majority of them honestly don't understand what it means for a theory, what a theory actually is. They treat economic theory as philosophy as opposed to what economics or the study of economics is, which is essentially the social and mathematical relation of the movement of wealth within a set area, whether it be the global economy, a national economy, a state, city, local, household economy.
Well,
And in
the
that, it becomes a sort of, in that economics is, in and of itself, a science. And so the scientific definition of theory would be what holds.
well
What
the
holds.
I was going to say that the primary reason why you would see like an empirical example that doesn't align with Austrian theory is that you would have things that aren't taken into account, right? Like the the Austrian assertion that um, you know uh, an increase in the or just even which I mean I guess this is something agreed upon by most economic schools, an increase in money supply um, or amount of just use money supply. An increase in money supply will lead to an increase in prices. This is like all other things equal. Like, empirically, you could have,
Right. Essentially, an increase in fiat decreases the overall value of
yeah,
fiat, thus making the price for an exchange of services higher.
yeah,
Yeah. No, that's the devaluation principle of monetary supply. That's something you find in every school of economics.
yeah. But
I mean,
it's
but just because it gets that one principle right, that doesn't grant carte blanche to the rest of it.
well,
For instance,
it's
for instance, um, Newton's theory of gravitation. It explains the movements of large bodies in space quite well, actually. Um, but once you get outside the local cluster, it doesn't necessarily fall apart, but it's not as accurate. And so this is where Einstein's theory of special relativity comes into play.
the Austrians arrive at the concept of inflation the same way that they arrive out of the entire Austrian theory is you have the action axiom and then you proceed to derive from that and you look at it theoretically. You look at theoretical economies and for the sake of determining um, the principles of it,
Right.
like for a large portion of like if you go through an Austria like human action or man economy and state, a large portion of it will be devoted to studying a theoretical economy that completely doesn't have the concept of uncertainty, so that you can determine these principles that don't rely on uncertainty and then later insert uncertainty in order to then proceed with the analysis.
Right, but that's something every every field of study, regardless of what school, quote unquote, you belong to, employs. It's called modeling. You use models to explain concepts in a practical sense. That doesn't necessarily mean that those concepts will hold or that model will work outside of that educational framework.
Well,
That's what a theory does. A theory is A theory is an explanation for a particular phenomena that is the best overall explanation that encompasses all currently available data that provides predictions with explanatory power. And if it can't make reliable predictions with explanatory power, then it's not a good theory.
Well, and the Austrian school is able to make reliable predictions. Like it's it's
Except the only predictions that I've ever, the at least that I've personally encountered, that doesn't mean that there's not more, but the ones that I've encountered that do tend to hold water are things around the concept of inflation. But when you look at it, the majority of it is repackaging of what other fields of economic theory that predate the Austrian school have already explained within their own theoretical frameworks. And so that's just copying the other kid's homework at that point. It's a good starting point, but if you're not building off of that and making better predictions, more accurate predictions, then it's not really going to work. Your theory still is not good. It's not a theory at that point. It's essentially just a failed bit of conjecture. Which, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Things that are proposed as theories fail all the time. And that's part of how we grow as human beings. It's part of how we learn and discover more about reality. So, I mean, a failure has, I would say, almost as much value as whatever the current theoretical model is at the time. Because while the current theoretical model explains to us what's actually going on, the failed models give us something to look at and see, okay, well, how did that fail? What did it not take into account? Or what was it taking into account in a way that was not accurate to how it actually impacted the system? And that allows us to use that information to then make better theories going forward. It's just part of the process.
well the 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 Austrian method. The reason that it's so proper is because as humans, like the economics is the study of human action, and as humans we are capable of thinking through action, because we are the subjects of study. Um, and also I'm pretty sure that it wasn't um like when it comes to like monetary stuff, that was primarily developed by the Austrians at the same time as most economic schools, like which was mostly like the German historical school and like classical school and stuff. Um, and the Austrians also, um, we we were the original. We're really like the only school that will uh, is able to make proper predictions when it comes to like the business cycle, because it was Mises who discovered the business cycle, and or not discovered, but was able to point to a cause of the business cycle, and and which was that it was the expansion, or the expansion of credit and malinvestment.
So I'm looking here, and let's see. Like I see where Ludwig von Mises wrote Theory of Money and Credit. That was 1912. Although the although they call it praxeology, I really I never really understood why they felt why the Mises Institute goes so hard on like, oh, we study praxeology when it's talking about the study of human behaviors related to economics. That's part of sociology. I don't understand why they can't just call themselves
Well,
economic
prax
sociologists because that's basically what they are. That is what they are.
well
Though
because
though I
praxeology
think
is
praxeology.
exclusively logical analysis. It's human logic, right? Like logical or
Right, and
functional
that's
logic.
but that's a fatal flaw right there, though. They're like this is one of the reasons why sociology becomes a relatively unreliable science, and is referred to as a soft science, um, and not a hard science, say like biology, chemistry, physics, etc. Um, in that it identifies and understands the fact that logic is not the primary driving force of the human experience. Emotion is.
Well, um it's not asserting that like all it's all logic that it's not.
But it focuses on the logical,
Yeah, it's
like
using
praxeology.
logic to analyze how people act.
Right, but I don't think, at least now. Granted, I may have just encountered some people who are just bad at explaining praxeology to me. Totally open to that being the case. Is that when they were talking about praxeology? Now, this has been some years ago. I do remember distinctly one of my initial criticisms being that it does not actually seem to take into account how humans influence each other through emotion primarily as opposed to logic. And though it seeks logical explanations, it tends to fail to account for emotional responses in some instances.
Well, the it doesn't at all assert that it can make predictions as to like exactly how humans will act. It's making predictions: if humans act this way, then it will lead to this. Right? Like praxeology, they don't use they take into account really just all wants and possible drivers of human action by um explaining that how people what drives action is that all people have an infinite list of things that they see as more preferable and things that they see as less preferable, and they're constantly trying to get more and more, higher on that list, whether they know it or not, right? Because it may not be it may not be known to the people, but they do have an infinitely long list of, oh, well, this is slightly more preferable than that, and this is slightly more preferable than that, and that's how you're able to determine how people will act. Like if you assert the because in order to use praxeology, you need to know the like preferences of the individual that you're the theoretical individual, not
Right,
preferences in
but from
general.
what I remember, praxeology doesn't have any mechanism within it to explain or account for, say, the unpredictability of human decision making. Because there are definitely times in which humans will act against their own self-interest.
What would you
There
mean
are
by
times,
act against their self-interest?
like for instance, there are times when a person, say, commits a selfless act, right? Not for they don't do it for recognition, they don't do it for bragging rights or anything. They see a thing and they do a thing.
Well, this is uh this is actually within their self-interest. It's just not because it's they themselves see it as a more valuable end that they help this other individual, even if like on the surface they don't actually live a better life because of this, or like it doesn't increase their standard of living, but it does actually, they do see it as beneficial to themselves that this other person is happier.
I mm, I would disagree. I'd say that's making an assumption that doesn't actually have any evidence to support it.
Well, just the very fact that the person did this charitable action is
That
proof that
doesn't.
is
No,
proof
that's not
that
proof. That's not proof that the assertion is correct. That's just proof that the individual acted. That's just evidence that a person acted.
well
Unless you unless you are inside that person's mind and looking at all of their neurosynaptic responses and actually determining where that decision is made and for what purpose, you can't actually say that it's proof positive of any particular framework.
well no, because we see that they acted accordingly. Action is employing means towards ends that are more preferable to the actor. We know for a fact that this person saw it more preferable that the individual, that they did this charitable thing and that they helped this individual.
Right, but that doesn't demonstrate that it's in that person's self-interest to do so. All
Well,
it is a demonstration that they acted.
it's in their self-interest because they saw it more beneficial, right? They acted in their self-interest, and their self-interest was that they would be happier if they did this charitable action.
Except that's not the reason why people or why certain people do quote unquote charitable things. Like for instance, like let's take into account um there was a man who was an accomplished swimmer, forget the actual country, um saw that a bus had gone over a bridge. Without thinking, just dives in the water and ultimately ends up saving every single child on board. He didn't do this for recognition. He didn't do this for his own happiness. He simply did this to save kids, to protect them from dying. That's not, I would not say that that's self-interest. Self-interest indicates that the individual making the decision is going to reap some sort of benefit from it.
Well,
And
even if it's not,
self-interest self-interest implies automatically self-awareness and awareness of the decision being made and for
well,
the purpose and intent behind it.
in jumping, like, it's the even if it isn't some tangible benefit, it just the very fact that he acted means that he would prefer, meaning he benefits simply because these kids are still alive, right? Wanted he saw it as more preferable that these kids are alive than if these kids are dead. And so he acted accordingly, according to his preference scale.
Except for the fact that when you're talking about this preference scale, that implies conscious decision making because preferences are conscious.
Yeah.
This was an unconscious decision to dive in and start saving people.
Well,
People generally do not make a conscious decision. Like you look at any interview of any person who's ever saved another person's life, what do they say virtually every single time when asked the inevitable question, well, what was going through your mind?
it's they 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 don't um they didn't think through the decision, but they did make the decision intentionally nonetheless.
No, because that decision happens in the unconscious brain, below the level of consciousness. There cannot be intention behind that at that point.
Well, if it's unintentional, then it's not action, because
No,
action is intentionally putting means towards ends. So it's clearly intentional.
No, I would say that's a misappropriation of the term action, truth be told. Because the actual definition, when we pull from Oxford Dictionary, is the fact or process of doing something, typically to achieve a name. Not exclusively, but typically. So an action in and of itself does not have to be conscious
Well,
by
regard
definition.
regardless of whether it's like psychologically conscious or unconscious, it's
They're
certainly an
they're
action.
right.
And
Action does not rely intent. Action does not necessitate intent. Just
well,
because intent is typical when an action occurs, that does not mean it is necessary that intent precede act.
well, just like there is so in order to act, all individuals at least have to think that they will benefit from it, and they might not
No,
even.
but you're still using this hackneyed redefinition of act or action without actually addressing the point that it is possible to act unconsciously, that it is possible to act without intent.
Well, it isn't because it
Except that it is.
well, no, just because you're not consciously thinking about something doesn't mean it's unintentional.
Yes, it does.
It just wasn't
Intent,
reasoning.
no, intent is a consequence of the conscious mind. If something happens unconsciously, then there is no underlying intent. Instinct is not intent. If you throw something at someone and they reflexively catch it, there was no intent in that action. It was a reflex. A reflex is a muscular response that happens in the parasympathetic nervous system that is not part of the conscious action. It is not part of the conscious decision making process. For instance, if you touch a hot stove, your hand recoils. You didn't decide to do that. You didn't intend to do that. It happened. That's a spinal reflex. The brain isn't even part of that process. So there are actions without intentions. This is clearly observable in nature, clearly observable in the natural world. So that definition of action falls apart on its face and doesn't hold any water.
Well, in so I guess there's a like
You can
difference in
disagree. You can disagree. You can have a difference of opinion, uh, as far as that goes. But overall, it's an inescapable fact that action does not belie intent.
well, there's I think a misunderstanding in that praxeology does not, it doesn't take into account like psychology, right? It's not like, oh, this is, conscious, this is unconscious.
If
It's
it's not taking into account psychology, then how is it? Then how can it purport to be an accurate analysis of human behavior?
because it's analyzing. So we can it's not actually possible to see preference scales beyond through action, right? Like action is how you discover someone's preference scales, And like even um if you were to ask me like, exactly what my preference scale is, I wouldn't be able to give it to you. I would have to be presented with the action or the opportunity to act in order to act, and then in acting I would, reveal my preference scale.
Right. So action can reveal preference, but not all action is based on preference. That is the flaw here that you're failing to address. Is that you've initially started this with the assertion that all action is preference, that all action is some form of preference. But preference takes place as a conscious decision.
Then so I think there's just a difference in what we mean by preference, because the way so preference means that um, within the context that I'm using it, I am saying that the actor um, would rather
A
do an act.
greater liking for one alternative over another or others. Sound good?
Yeah,
That's from the Oxford Dictionary.
yeah.
So if we take a look at that, a greater liking for one alternative over another, that indicates that there is some engagement of the conscious mind at that point.
Well, but within the context of
Even if you don't
practicality.
understand even if you don't understand the why behind a particular preference, like for instance, let's say for instance you prefer carrots over peas on your dinner plate, right? Let's just, for the sake of discussion, say you prefer carrots over peas.
Yeah.
You may not know precisely for what reason you prefer carrots over peas, but you do make the conscious decision to not put the peas on your plate, but to put carrots on your plate. So
Mm-hmm.
even if you don't understand the preference or the reasoning behind the preference, you are engaging your conscious mind in exercising said preference. Yes,
Um, Hold on, restate that.
I said even if you don't understand immediately or cannot immediately identify the reasoning behind your preference of one thing over another,
Mm-hmm.
you are still exercising your conscious mind to assert the preference.
Well,
You're making
practicology is
a conscious
nothing to
decision.
do with why preferences exist. It simply acknowledges that people have preferences and they act accordingly.
Right. And they act accordingly. But if preferences are a result of conscious thought, of a conscious decision, but not all action is conscious, then by necessity, not all action is based within preference.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing that you seem to not be able to address.
So I think I I I actually I guess I do not have as deep an understanding of everything as I thought I did. Um,
It's okay. It's okay.
so I don't think
That's
it.
the purpose for discussions.
Yeah,
That's the purpose for discussion. It's a learning experience. I'm not doing all this to dunk on you. I'm
no.
not trying to make you feel stupid. It's I'm trying to both set your argument up as strong as we possibly can, and then explain the problems within that.
Mm,
Because the ultimate goal is for you to reevaluate your position and either set it aside if it's no longer if it truly is no longer working, or you come back with something better
Yep.
with an even stronger argument, which makes for even better discussion and more learning. And that's the whole point.
So yeah, I how long has it been? It's been
It's been
10
about,
minutes.
yeah, roughly.
Um, so yeah, I wasn't expecting it to go on past like 3. Um, but
Oh, so it's right at three. Well, it's right at two for you right now. I mean, we can keep going
no,
if you want.
it's 3 right now. Um,
Oh, that's right. Yeah, it's almost two for me. Duh.
all
So it must be three for you.
right.
My bad. Math brain didn't want to math there for a second.
I actually I'll recommend I I don't know why, but his Discord server he doesn't have invites to it enabled. Um
Obviously, I need to reread Anatomy of the State.
uh
Because it's been a while since I've read Rothbard's work.
yeah. I'm currently in the middle of reading For a New Liberty. And
I need to break out my copy of Locke's two treatises on government.
yeah, reading For a New Liberty, Rothbard cites Locke a bunch in the second chapter, and that's like, man, I should read like actually read Locke beyond just you know.
No, yeah, Locke's treatises on government are actually really great reads. There's definite holes, but there again, I mean, no philosophical framework ever really stands the test of time, because essentially most philosophical frameworks are a product of their time, and as such, either grow, adapt, change, or break as time goes on and more people analyze them.
All right, but yeah, I want to recommend to you. I suppose shoot him a friend request. Liquid Zulu. He also has a YouTube channel. Um, because I think it will do my position a lot more justice than I have. Um,
Okay. Do you know what his YouTube channel is called, or is it just called Liquid Zulu?
Liquid Zulu, yeah.
Okay, let me grab a
I
piece of
will warn
paper.
you, he is British.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure why that would be a problem.
But yeah. All right. So I guess that's the end of that. I'll stop recording.